Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming from near and far away. My name is Jason Walsh. I'm a senior policy advisor here at the White House. We are very excited to be hosting the White House Summit on Nuclear Energy and to be joined by such an impressive audience and such a great group of speakers. You should all have an agenda or be sitting next to someone who has an agenda or have seen an agenda at some point in the last couple of hours. You'll see that we have 3 panels of speakers this afternoon who will discuss the importance of nuclear power across multiple vectors and actions being taken today and into the future to sustain and advance nuclear power. We will also hear from a number of young scientists and engineers who we think are representative of the next generation, the new generation entering the field of nuclear energy and moving it forward. And as bookends to this afternoon, you'll hear from 2 administration leaders, Dr. John Holdren and Dr. Liz Sherwood-Randall. For the panels, you'll hear remarks from our moderators and speakers and questions from moderators to speakers. We'll also have about 10 minutes at the end of each panel for questions from the audience. The way that we're going to do this is that at some point over the course of the panel, probably after remarks, the moderator will say, if you have a question, raise your hand, and then we'll have a couple of folks passing out cards. You'll write down your question and then pass the note back to the person you got the card from, and we will somehow try to make sense of all of that. I want to give thanks to a couple of organizations. There were a number of organizations who helped us put this together. I want to single out a couple. First to Third Way for being really invaluable partners in helping us think through this event and also design the agenda, the third panel of which John Cowan, president of Third Way, will be moderating at the end. I also want to thank Idaho National Laboratory. Those of you who come to White House events know that our typical practice is to make you as thirsty and hungry and physically uncomfortable as possible. There'll still be some of that, don't worry, but at the break, we will have coffee and some refreshments, courtesy of INL. So I want to thank them for that, and then incidentally, all of their groundbreaking RD&D over multiple generations in nuclear energy technology. Some housekeeping notes: please turn off the ringers of your various devices. As I referenced, there will be a break. It will be after our second panel. There are also, for folks who don't know, bathrooms as you go out. They'll be to your left. Men's, I think, is on the first floor. Women's on the second floor. This summit is being live streamed, so don't say or do anything that you wouldn't want to have end up in the National Archives. And I think that's it. We're really excited that you're all here and that we're doing this summit. On that note, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. John Holdren, who is Assistant to the President for Science and Technology, Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, otherwise known as PCAST. Dr. Holdren holds advanced degrees in aerospace engineering and theoretical plasma physics from MIT and Stanford. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as the former president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In short, he is an underachiever. Dr. Holdren, will you come on up, please? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. And on behalf of President Obama, thanks to all of you for coming. This is an amazing crowd. I have been entertaining myself by reading the list of participants and your affiliations. I have to extend a particular note of thanks to Kirsten Cutler from OSTP for all the work she put in organizing this meeting and helping us recruit such an amazing collection of leaders in this field. As everybody is aware, President Obama considers addressing the global climate change challenge to be a top priority. At the end of August at the Glacier Conference in Alaska, he said the following, quote, "I am convinced that no challenge poses a greater threat to our future and future generations than a changing climate. This is one of those rare issues because of its magnitude, because of its scope, that if we don't get it right, we may not be able to reverse, and we may not be able to adapt sufficiently. There is such a thing as being too late when it comes to climate change," close quote. The challenge of acting in time and ultimately acting adequately is daunting both for the United States and for the world. Let me take a look at the numbers. Most of the world's nations have embraced the goal of holding the increase in the globally and annually averaged near-surface air temperature to 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. Today, we're pushing through 0.9 degrees Celsius and still rising. The middle-of-the-road estimates by the climate science community are that achieving a high likelihood of keeping the ultimate increase below 2 degrees C will require global reductions in the offending emissions, principally greenhouse gases, but also particulate black carbon, by something in the range of 50% below 1990 levels by 2050, and all the way to zero by or before 2100. Under the widely shared assumption that the industrialized countries, having contributed the larger part of cumulative atmospheric buildup of greenhouse gases to date, should go first and initially fastest in emissions reductions, the United States and many other industrial nations have agreed to aim for something like 80% reductions from 1990 levels by 2050. 80%. Now, in terms of heat-trapping potential on a 100-year timescale, carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel use have lately accounted for about 55% of total greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, and carbon dioxide emissions from electric power plants have accounted for about 40% of that, or 22% of the global total. In the United States, CO2 emissions from fossil fuel are about 3/4 of national greenhouse gas emissions, with electric power generation accounting, as it does worldwide, for about 40% of the CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use in total. Thus, in this country, CO2 from power generation is 30% of national emissions of all greenhouse gases, all types. Both for the United States and for the world, the electric power sector is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases among all sectors of human activity. It's bigger than transportation, it's bigger than agriculture, it's bigger than non-electric uses of energy in industry, and it's bigger than non-electric uses of energy in residential and commercial buildings. That means that national and global goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions can only be met with the help of significant emissions reductions in the electric power sector. Indeed, probably larger than proportionate cuts, given the leverage that comes from the degree to which both emissions and decisions in this sector are concentrated in large facilities and large organizations. But achieving reductions in the magnitude required is going to be a huge challenge. Both in the United States and worldwide, 2/3 of electricity generation still comes from burning coal, oil, and natural gas, and virtually all of that without any capture of the carbon dioxide combustion product. 2 billion tons of CO2 per year from fossil fuel power plants in the United States, 13 billion tons worldwide. I might add that over 70% of that global power sector total is coming from coal-fired power plants, more than 70%. Of the 1/3 of global electricity generation currently coming from non-fossil sources, about half is coming from hydropower, 1/3 is coming from nuclear, and 1/6 is coming from non-hydro renewables. In the United States, in round numbers, 60% of the non-fossil generation is nuclear, 20% is hydro, and the last 20% is the non-hydro renewables. But nuclear generation, as everyone in this room knows, I think, has been more or less flat in gigawatt hours generated for a decade, and hydro for far longer than that, fluctuating mainly with differences in runoff. Only the non-hydro renewables have been growing recently, and very dramatically at that. In the case of wind, It increased more than threefold between 2008 and 2014. Solar electricity generation increased more than 20-fold between 2008 and 2014. The most conspicuous greenhouse gas relevant trend on the fossil generation side in the United States has, of course, been the rising prominence of natural gas, which went from 16% of generation in 2000 to 27% in 2014, while coal fell from 52% in 2000 to 39% in 2014. So looking ahead, what are the options for achieving the deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector that are needed? I'm sure everybody in this room could recite the list. It's not that long. Increased efficiency in electricity end use, more switching from coal to natural gas, advanced fossil fuel power plants with higher efficiency, and much more important, but also more difficult and costly, the capacity to capture, use, and store carbon dioxide. More renewables for electricity generation, particularly some of the non-hydro renewables, notably wind and solar, that have large potential for further expansion. More nuclear fission, and ultimately, maybe nuclear fusion if it can be made practical and affordable. All of these options have attractions. All of them have shortcomings, including for some hurdles to be overcome in terms of practicality, economics, or public acceptance, with the prospects for overcoming these hurdles subject to considerable uncertainty. Increased end-use efficiency is at least arguably the largest and cheapest option. After all, from 1975 to 2010, the United States reduced the amount of primary energy needed to yield a real dollar of GDP by a factor of 2 at modest and sometimes negative cost. Every respectable study shows that there is much more potential where that came from. But still, efficiency has limits. One still needs supply. And in the case of electricity, there's reason to think that demand will be driven up by such rapidly expanding end uses as the increasing electrification of transportation and perhaps desalination of seawater. As for the supply side, again, I think we all pretty much know where the challenges lie. Burning natural gas still releases a lot of CO2, although much less than coal, and careful attention has to be paid to methane leaks in production and transport to avoid offsetting even that advantage. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage for fossil-fueled power plants is still at an early stage of development, with costs that are highly uncertain, but in no event likely to be attractive unless there is a substantial actual or virtual price on carbon. Intermittent renewables, such as wind and solar, become more challenging with respect to integration with other sources the larger their share becomes, and their cost goes up substantially in circumstances where storage is required. Growing biofuels for electricity generation is demanding of land and water and may compete with food production, as well as entailing high costs in transporting the fuel to centralized power plants. Nuclear fusion, of course, doesn't work yet, and we can't be sure it will or what it will cost if it does. And as for nuclear fission, the focus of this meeting, I'll come to its challenges in just a moment. But the point I want to make first is that this litany of challenges facing our options for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector is not a reason for taking any of them off the table. Given the importance, indeed the imperative, of electricity supply that is adequate, affordable, reliable, secure, and far more climate-friendly than today's, the only sensible strategy is to do everything we reasonably can do through research, development, innovation, and public-private partnership to master the challenges that each option presents, to give the best chance of being able to fashion a deployed mix of electricity supply options that meets all of these criteria and one other, a high degree of portfolio diversity as a hedge against inevitable uncertainty and surprises. And that precisely is this administration's strategy. Let me turn finally to the challenges facing the nuclear fission option. the challenges that we must count on research, development, innovation, and public-private partnerships to address. And again, I think we all know what they are. They are to reduce capital cost, to maximize safety against malfunction, mistakes, malevolence, and natural disasters, to manage radioactive waste in ways that are not merely technically sound, but that can gain the confidence of the public, and to minimize the pathways by which nuclear energy technology could contribute to the proliferation of nuclear weapons. What today's meeting is precisely about is how ingenuity and innovation and partnership can contribute to overcoming these challenges and thus to making nuclear energy everything that it can be, and thus a major contributor in this country and worldwide to minimizing the risks from climate change. I look forward to hearing the terrific ideas I'm sure will materialize from this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Holdren. On our first panel, we will hear from several very informed speakers about the importance of nuclear power domestically and internationally to meeting our climate mitigation goals. As Dr. Holdren just referenced, mitigating climate change is one of the President's top priorities, which he is demonstrating on a day-to-day basis, including today. I will briefly note our two most significant domestic and international climate initiatives, both of which you'll hear more about from our speakers. Domestically, of course, the Clean Power Plan, released earlier this year, includes the first ever national standards to limit carbon pollution from power plants. Existing power plants, as I'm sure you all know, are the largest source of carbon pollution in the US. And yet until the Clean Power Plan, there were no national limits on the amount of carbon pollution they could emit. That wasn't smart and it wasn't safe. The Clean Power Plan builds on progress that states and companies are already making towards a clean energy future. It sets long-term market signals, which will drive innovation and investments in low-carbon energy and energy efficiency. And since we finalized the rule, we've seen concrete progress from states and utilities who think the CPP is practical, not partisan, and who are coming to the table to develop state plans tailored to their own economies and their own energy mixes. Nuclear power is, of course, the largest source of zero carbon electric power in the United States. By putting limits on carbon pollution from fossil fuel-fired power plants in the CPP, we are helping to make sure that the cost of that pollution and the value of zero-emitting sources like nuclear will be taken into account. I'm not going to say any more about the Clean Power Plan because Janet McCabe, who knows just a little bit about the subject, will make that the focus of her remarks. Internationally, you all know that we are just a few weeks away from the Paris Climate Conference. You also know, I think, that electricity demand is on track to double globally by 2050, and that by some estimates, nuclear energy generation must increase by an amount equivalent to roughly doubling the current number of nuclear plants in operation if warming is to be limited to 2 degrees Celsius. As we approach Paris, more than 150 countries representing nearly 90% of global emissions have committed to 2025 or 2030 targets. We believe securing an ambitious and durable agreement in Paris is in reach. Nuclear power will be one among many technology pathways to fulfilling country commitments, but we think it will be one of the most important. Paul Bodner, whose every waking hour is consumed by the Paris conference, will be able to tell us more about that. I'm going to stop there and introduce our panelists and ask them to come up one at a time, and then when they're finished with their remarks, sit down next to me, and then when we're done with that, we will have a little time for conversation. So our panelists are Janet McCabe, who's the Acting Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation at the US EPA. David Christian, CEO of Dominion Generation Group. Ken Caldera, a climate scientist at the Carnegie Institution for Science in the Department of Global Ecology at Stanford University. William D. Magwood IV, Director General of the OECD's Nuclear Energy Agency, and finally, Paul Bardner, who's the Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change at the White House National Security Council. Janet, can I ask you to come to the stage, please?
Thanks, Jason, and thanks to everybody for being here, and thanks for including EPA. And I don't know quite why we got the honor of leadoff hitter today, but I'll take it. I think it's wonderful that the White House has gathered you all together and is putting on this event. As Jason said, and as Administrator McCarthy would certainly echo if she were here and not on her way back from Dubai, and another important climate event. The EPA is very much behind President Obama's all of the above energy strategy. We are not an energy agency, and we don't try to be an energy agency. We're an environmental and public health agency, and our job is to implement, in my case, the Clean Air Act, in order to put in place sensible policies that comport with the Clean Air Act and reduce emissions of pollutants that have found to cause harm to the public health and the environment. Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have been so found by EPA, and that's been confirmed by the vast majority of scientists working on these issues, and also by the Supreme Court. So science or lawyers, take your pick. They agree on that. As Jason mentioned, this summer, the administrator and the president announced a really historic regulatory program, the Clean Power Plan. It had been in the works for several years. My guess is that many people in this room are pretty familiar with the Clean Power Plan and perhaps even filed comments on. How many people filed comments on the Clean Power Plan in this room? So that's a pretty good, thank you very much for all of you. You are a small portion of the 4.3 million people across the country. We didn't have a room big enough at the White House for all those people, but I'd love to get them together sometime. That would be really fun. The volume of those comments suggests a couple things that I think are pretty clear. One is just the immense importance of this issue and how much people care about it, but also the complexity of it and the views that people wanted to get in front of us. Indeed, some of the comments that we got were longer in number of pages than the proposal itself, which was not a slim volume, I can assure you. So lots to look at, and certainly input from and about nuclear power was very, very prominent. This, of course, is not an energy rule. It is a rule about fossil-fired power plants. That's our authority under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. But as Jason noted, and as Dr. Holdren noted, this is all a big system. And so the requirements that our rule places on coal and gas-fired plants certainly fits into, and indeed is designed to fit into, as we laid out in the rule, how the energy system works. So I'm getting carried away here, and I'm going to run out of time. So I'm going to stop diverging from my carefully planned written remarks. When the plan is in place, fully compliant in 2030, carbon pollution will go down 32% compared to 2005 levels. That's significant. A significant co-benefit is great decreases in other air pollutants that come along with fossil generation, SO2 and NOx, and that's good. We expect that coal and natural gas will continue to be leading sources of power generation in the country, but we expect nuclear power to hold steady or perhaps grow. It is at about 20% now, and that's what our analysis showed. I want to focus the rest of my very few minutes on how nuclear power is generated. Am I out already? Oh, dear. Okay. Let me just wrap up then.
Take one or two more.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. That nuclear power is treated in the Clean Power Plan like any other zero-carbon power source. If anything, that's the most important thing to take away from this. The Clean Power Plan is based on the fact that we have an integrated system where lots of different sources of energy contribute to the electrons that light up our houses. And whether it's wind energy or solar energy or nuclear energy or hydropower, or energy efficiency, all of those things can play into these plans that Jason referred to that the states are putting together. We have a system allowed under the plan of very flexible states designing their own plans to accommodate their own energy mixes. But we also recognize that power travels around and between and among states, and so the system is intended to allow those kinds of compliance plans where states can set up and utilities can set up trading programs and credit generation programs so that clean energy can create value for itself and replace the carbon-intensive fuels. So that is the most important thing for you to take away. It is not within our power in this rule to drive a place for any one particular kind of energy generation. But we did want to make sure that the nuclear energy, just like other zero carbon, had the ability to compete. And states have the ability to design their plans in ways that can encourage different kinds of energy. And if nuclear power is a significant part of their own energy mix, then the Clean Power Plan allows them the flexibility to do that. I brought a fact sheet that we put together just recently in honor of this event, that I hope will be useful broadly on nuclear power and the Clean Power Plan. Please get a copy on your way out, and it will be on our website. It makes clear that whether states choose to go through a mass-based approach or a rate-based approach, nuclear power has a place in those plans. The last thing I want to say, and then I really will stop, is that I want to encourage all of you to be in touch with your states. They are now, as Jason said, they are starting work on what their plans are going to look like. And one thing we put in the plan was a clear direction to the states to have very robust public engagement processes with the stakeholders in their states. So whatever stakeholder constituency you represent, you should be talking to your state environmental and energy agencies and make sure you know what process they're going to run in order to get appropriate feedback as they design those plans. So again, thank you very much. Sorry to take more time than I was allowed, and I look forward to the rest of the panel.
David, why don't you come on up?
Good afternoon, and thank you, Jason, and thank you, Janet, for those comments. I am honored to be here today and thankful of the privilege and the opportunity to participate in this discussion. For you to know how personally gratifying it is for me, I must tell you this, that 40 years ago, as an engineering student at Virginia Tech, I became familiar with a theory then known as the greenhouse effect. And after studying the impact of various technologies for producing electricity and the impact that that would have on the planet, I drew on all the faculties available to a 20-year-old and selected nuclear energy as a career field. I thought the country was going to need it, and I thought the planet was going to need it. So here we are 40 years later, witness to the fact that there has been a penetration of the American consciousness, indeed the global consciousness, that nuclear power can and will play a meaningful role in mitigating the potential impacts of climate change. As Janet said, nuclear power provides carbon-free, low-cost, round-the-clock energy for our customers. She didn't say our customers, but I'm saying our customers. And it provides high-paying jobs for our employees and significant economic benefits to our host communities. Dominion has 4 operating reactors in Virginia and 2 in Connecticut, providing some 40% of Virginia's electricity and 50% of Connecticut's electricity. Our customers reap the benefits of nuclear power, as it is the key reason that our rates are well below the national averages. Just as important, nuclear energy is the primary reason that Dominion ranks among the least carbon-intensive major electric utility generator in the U.S., and we intend to keep it that way. This morning, we transmitted a letter of intent to the U.S. NRC to submit for a second license renewal application at our Surry plant. The 2 reactors at Surry have operated safely and reliably for over 4 decades. Surry 1 began commercial operation in 1972, and Surry 2 followed in the spring of 1973. I'll remind you, it was an era when state and federal regulators were encouraging utilities to convert from coal to oil, as oil was viewed as more environmentally friendly than coal and less costly than nuclear. But in the fall of '73, oil prices tripled in what energy analysts call the first oil shock. Dominion customers have benefited for more than 40 years from the courageous decision of our leadership at that time to build these units. We have never had cause to regret that decision. Today, Surrey's operating costs are among the lowest in the nation. Licenses are set to expire, though, in 2032 and 2033, respectively, just after the 2030 implementation milestone in the Clean Power Plan. As a recent Third Way report notes, if U.S. plants are to begin retiring in droves, achieving the Clean Power Plan emissions reductions targets could be impossible. Over the next several years, we'll submit thousands of pages to the NRC demonstrating the safety and technical feasibility of extending Surrey's operating licenses. We're excited to be the first utility in the U.S. to begin this process. But in addition to the technical issues, we also have to run through the business case to make sure that license extension makes sense for our customers and our shareholders. Our long history with nuclear power is encouraging on all these fronts. It is in our societal interest to keep operating well-functioning, carbon-free nuclear units. Losing this emission-free capacity as a result of shortcomings in energy policy would be more than unfortunate. It would be tragic. I speak from experience in this regard, as 2 years ago, Dominion decided to shut down the Kewaunee nuclear station in Wisconsin. Despite having invested to extend its license to 2033, and despite many accolades for outstanding operational performance, Kewaunee had to be shut down due to unfavorable economics owing to low natural gas prices and Powder River Basin coal prices and an expiring power purchase agreement. As a result, carbon dioxide emissions have increased in the state of Wisconsin by over 5 million tons per year. We cannot afford more such policy failures if we are to achieve the desired carbon reduction goals advanced by the President. And on that point, I'll conclude with a few comments on the CPP, the Clean Power Plan. At Dominion, since our landmark New Source Review Agreement with the EPA and our state regulators in 2002, we have dramatically reduced our emissions while maintaining reliable and stable service to our customers. Dominion will work with the Commonwealth of Virginia to craft a workable state implementation plan, and we will advocate for an approach that is friendly to both the environment and to our customers. We believe that these goals are not mutually exclusive and can be reached. Nuclear power is a critical part of achieving that balance. I appreciate the opportunity to join in this discussion. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ken Caldera with the Carnegie Institution for Science, and thank you for inviting me. And first, I'd like to say that it's really encouraging to see the administration arguing for a broad portfolio and supporting nuclear power at this meeting in preparation for COP21, and hopefully other countries will embrace the portfolio approach that's embraced by our government. So I'd like to do a couple of things here. Basically, I'm going to take a cue from the previous speaker and give a little biographical background, and then talk a little bit about the role that scientists and environmentalists might play in helping nuclear power to achieve its potential. And I'm probably one of the few people in this room who was arrested demonstrating against nuclear power at a nuclear power plant. In the early 1980s, I was arrested at the front gates of the Shoreham Power Plant, Long Island, for which I'm sure Long Island ratepayers are ready to thank me for that. And since that time, obviously I decided to go to graduate school and study climate science. And there's a few things about climate and the carbon cycle that I became aware of. I mean, first of all, one thing is the unprecedented nature of what we're doing. That to find a time in Earth history where CO2 concentrations or where climate was changing as rapidly as it is right now, you probably have to go back some tens of millions of years. And if we look at, the IPCC projects something like 2 feet of sea level rise this century, but we just published a paper looking at, well, what happens in the longer term. And our model project that if we continue down the current trajectory, that in 1,000 years, sea level could be, say, 100 feet higher than it is today, with average levels of sea level rise of an inch a year. So part of my personal trajectory recently, I think the reason why I'm here is 3 other prominent climate scientists and myself wrote a letter advocating renewed effort improving and deploying nuclear power in response to the climate threat. And one of the signers of that letter, Kerry Emanuel, had predicted that climate change would lead to intensification of hurricanes. Well, there was just a hurricane that landed into Mexico that had the most intense winds ever measured in a hurricane. Hurricane force cyclone hit Yemen, the Arabian Peninsula, a week or 2 ago, which was the first time in recorded history that such a storm had ever hit the Arabian Peninsula. And both of these are associated with high sea surface temperatures and consistent with global warming. And so we're starting to see the kinds of things that the models have been projecting. Another body of research shows that each carbon dioxide emission leads to another increment of warming. And so if you want to stabilize atmospheric CO2 concentration, if you want to stabilize temperatures, I'm already to a minute, my God. If you want to stabilize temperatures, you basically have to eliminate emissions. The demand for energy services over this next century is likely to increase by an order of magnitude. At the same time, over this century, we probably need to decrease emissions by an order of magnitude. So if you need to provide 10 times as much energy services with 1/10 the emissions, you're getting down to that 1% level, which means that you're not going to do that. Most likely, you're not going to do that without nuclear power. And so I think that the scientists and environmentalists the environmental community should be embracing nuclear power as one of the very few technologies that can provide high-density power in an environmentally acceptable way. And I think that scientists like myself might be a good pathway to the environmental community in that scientists are trained to look at facts. And so when I was demonstrating in front of Shoreham, it was after 3 Mile Island, this idea of radiation, and meltdown and all of this, and the whole nuclear weapons thing in the background, that my response was a rational, fact-based response. And I think it's really important to get scientists to look at the actual data on what's the mortality rates due to coal burning versus nuclear burning and so on. And I think when the scientists gain the understanding, scientists will change their mind, and hopefully the rest of the environmental community will follow. So I guess I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's good to see all of you here today, especially since most of you are very familiar with me. I know this isn't about me, but it certainly feels like it is because there are people here that trace my whole life. There's people from the electric utility industry back when I worked at the EEI. There's people here from the Clinton administration at DOE. There's Bush administration from DOE, nuclear regulatory commissioners. Hi, Christine. It's really great to see all of you because this is an important conversation. Today, I'm coming from Paris, so I'm still a little jet lagged, so excuse me if I say anything that's completely insane. But what I'll try to do today is give you a quick snapshot of what we're thinking about from the international perspective. The NEA, the Nuclear Energy Agency, is part of the OECD, and our job is to facilitate cooperation among 31 member countries. Now, you can imagine our member countries are quite diverse. They range from Germany, which is shutting down nuclear plants, to the UK, which is building them as fast as they can, to almost everything in between. Recently we added Russia as a member country. We have small countries such as Luxembourg. We have big countries. We have a pretty wide range. So you can imagine that the discussions among those countries can be quite interesting if they agree on very, very few things, including my budget, as it turns out. But one thing that they do all seem to agree about is that there needs to be significant action taken on climate change. This is within the OECD countries, something that's become quite of a very remarkable unified position that they've all taken. Now, while the details about what to do and how to do it are all over the place, clearly the interest in doing something is very strong. So my organization, working in concert with our sister organization, the International Energy Agency, which is also located in Paris, have worked together and created something that we call the 2°C scenario. The 2°C scenario is designed to look at how we would actually achieve our energy supply requirements under the restriction that we were trying to meet this 2°C target that John Holgen talked about earlier. And it proves to be a very interesting exercise if you look at this from simply a combinatoric point of view. And we don't have view graphs, but I do have a slide, which actually is, there'll be handouts. Where's Faye? Faye, where are you? Well, Faye will make the handouts available to you after the session. But I'll tell you what this says. What this basically says is that this is going to be very difficult. This is going to be difficult because we are going to have to increase the use of renewables very dramatically. Solar will have to increase quite dramatically. Wind will have to increase dramatically. Carbon sequestration will have to be used quite significantly. We'll have to use more gas, and we're going to have to use more nuclear. As a matter of fact, in this scenario, which was done by the IEA, not by the NEA, nuclear will have to increase 2.3 times in order to meet the scenario. That's the equivalent of 500 large nuclear power plants built in addition to what we operate today. That's going to be a very, very difficult goal. Now, many countries, as I said, don't believe that nuclear power is part of the answer. Some countries quite aggressively feel that nuclear power is not part of the answer. But I think the message of the 2°C scenario is really simply this, that if you take nuclear off the table, the task of meeting these targets becomes very, very difficult, if not impossible. So if you take nuclear off, then you have to have that much more wind, you have to have that much more solar, that much more carbon sequestration. And the risk on all of those are already quite high. So this is a very, very challenging effort. And this assumes, by the way, that we're going to vastly increase our efficiency we're currently on track, I think, as someone mentioned earlier, to basically double electricity demand by 2050. This scenario assumes it only increases worldwide by about 75%, and for within the OECD countries, much less, because we're expecting to see much, much greater use of electricity in the developing world. Well, let me just conclude by saying that I will also provide you this brochure. The NEA is one of the few organizations that are nuclear experienced that will actually be in the middle of the COP effort and will be in the blue zone. And we're going to provide this brochure, which I'm giving you this to you early today, so you're the first to get it. So this will be available to you as well as after the session. So look forward to the continued discussion. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Unfortunately, I don't have a brochure for you, but hopefully in a few weeks, I'll be able to bring you an international climate agreement. And I won't get to hang out in the blue zone in the COP because I'll be stuck in the red zone. But I just want to give you a little bit of an orientation to the diplomatic side of the international climate challenge. You know, climate change has proved to be one of the most difficult problems that the international community has ever tried to deal with in the international relations context, because it's a collective action problem, because it's in the interest of every country to wait until others act, because there are intergenerational problems that are particularly difficult to deal with. Now, the United States is obviously committed to leading the world in the transition to a low-carbon economy. And as others have mentioned, in that transition, we see a strong role for nuclear energy. Jason noted that we're a few weeks from Paris, so let me tell you a little bit about what that's about in just a couple minutes. We've been chasing a solution for 20-plus years to how you design an international regime that works and incentivizes strong action on climate change and emission reductions. But the solutions that we've come up with so far, the Kyoto Protocol, even the Copenhagen Accord, which the President helped broker, are not enough. And we've learned a lot along the way. So when we came into office, we decided that we needed a different approach than the Kyoto Protocol approach that was not politically accepted here in the United States, an approach that's designed for the economic realities of the next century and beyond. And we started with the hardest issue of all, which is how are the US and China going to agree on an approach to climate change? And the US and China were traditionally cast as the captains of opposing teams in this debate. The international climate discourse was heavily about historic responsibility and compensation and who's responsible and who should pay whom. And President Obama and President Xi managed to really break that mold and usher in a new era of climate diplomacy last year when they stood together and announced to the world a surprise announcement of our post-2020 climate targets. And I think that approach, which is to say it's time to stop arguing about the past and start focusing on the future, has really paid off. As Jason mentioned, more than 150 countries have now put forward their climate targets, representing almost 90% of global emissions. Now, those targets for 2025 and 2030 are not going to get us all the way to keeping global temperatures below 2 degrees increase above pre-industrial levels. They're just for 2025 and 2030. They're just the next step in this story. And what the Paris Agreement is about creating a system that allows countries to ratchet their emissions down over the coming decades towards a decarbonization of the global economy by the end of the century. So it's a system, it's a machine, it's a ratchet that we're trying to design. Hopefully every 5 years, countries will put forward newer and newer targets that get more and more ambitious over time with this long-term goal in mind. That's our vision for the Paris Agreement. And if you read that in the headlines after the Paris Climate Conference, you will know that we will have succeeded. In that system is technology neutral. It's built on the notion that countries decide what they want to do, but with a lot of incentives to be ambitious. It's a so-called nationally determined approach. So we will get to choose, just as every country gets to choose, how we meet ambitious targets. What countries are held accountable for is their emissions. How they meet emissions targets is up to them. And certainly, from the perspective of the United States, nuclear power is a very important component of that strategy, as it is for China, as it is for India, as it is for Japan and other countries. So I met with a group of you a little while ago and was happy to see that you have long memories. Some remember a provision that was put in place as part of Kyoto called the Bonn Agreement, which I don't think anyone else remembers, which didn't make nuclear power eligible under the carbon market provisions of the Kyoto Protocol. Those days are long gone. And we move forward from Paris with a technology-neutral approach. And so I hope that you see Paris as one of the most important pieces of stimulus in our time, potentially, for accelerating the transition to a low-carbon economy, in which nuclear power really has a comparative advantage over other forms of baseload power generation. So that's the most basic frame I can give you, and I'd be happy to answer questions and have a dialogue. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, but while I'm doing that, let me ask my colleagues who are going to be passing out notes and then collecting them from the audience to raise their hands on both sides. You know who you are? Okay. So if you've got a question, please raise your hand. and we'll make sure a card gets to you, and then you can write that question down, and then pass it back to whoever gave you that card, okay? And then at some point, one of my colleagues is gonna bring them up here, and I will do my best to decipher the handwriting and ask the question of the panel. Okay. Can people hear me okay, or do I need a mic? You need a mic, okay. Is the mic on? Yes. Okay. I'm going to ask a question of Janet McCabe. Janet, at the end of your remarks, you made a reference to mass-based versus rate-based. I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about this, because of course this is a choice that states will have, and what the implications of that would be for nuclear energy.
Rule, as pretty much most EPA rules, are written in terms of a rate of carbon per unit of electricity produced. The Clean Air Act doesn't seek to limit the amount of production. It seeks to make each unit of production very, very clean. So that's the basic approach, that fossil energy needs to meet a lower rate of carbon intensity. And the way the rule is set up, states and utilities can use clean energy and average that in with their fossil units. Because there are some states already moving ahead to an approach that involves a mass-based approach, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative states in the Northeast and California, we heard from states, please provide us an opportunity to design a plan that sets a mass-based target, and then we work towards that. So the rule allows that. In both cases, nuclear power can participate. It can generate emission rate credits that utilities can use to offset their carbon rate from their fossil plants. Alternatively, if it's a mass-based approach and nuclear power is taking the place of fossil power, it sort of seamlessly helps the state reach their target. So either way is appropriate, and in either case, nuclear power can definitely be a very vigorous tool and effective tool.
Thank you, Jenna. Dave, there are a number of drivers for the premature economic shutdown of nuclear plants, some of which federal policy has control over, some of which it does not. Could you talk a little bit more about what you see as the most important federal policy drivers? In other words, what can the federal government do to mitigate premature economic shutdown?
At the federal level, I actually think we're going to have to strive for a confluence of market policy, which has got some tie-in with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, state policy, and then and perhaps in some cases, particularly in the Midwest, we need to be thoughtful about how long we keep incentives in place once a technology has become matured and you've got very large-scale deployment of it that results in some regional market distortion. So I don't think there's necessarily a single federal answer there. I think we're going to have a confluence of state focus, market policy focus, and perhaps some federal focus to prevent these plants from closing down.
Thank you, Dave. Bill, there's obviously, I mean, you're here representing the OECD, which is for the most part already developed economies. But I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about the challenge we face of delinking economic growth from increased carbon pollution.
Well, over the last, I'd say 20 years, we started to see a little separation between GDP growth in many countries and carbon emissions, but they still track quite closely, and we're going to have to delink them much further if we're going to be successful in meeting any of these targets. And this is going to be extraordinarily difficult, particularly in developing countries, because in developing countries we have something on the order of 1.5 billion people that have no access to electricity at all. And they're going to get access to electricity, and they are going to be driving a lot of the emissions and a lot of the energy use in the future. So the only way to really delink them further is to rely more on low carbon technologies. One thing, and this is a little bit of a corollary to what Dave was saying a few minutes ago, one thing we find around almost all of the OECD member countries is that the policies in place across the board in market design, in tax policy, and a lot of other areas incentivize use of fossil fuels and actually penalize low carbon technologies, not just nuclear, but nuclear, renewables, and others as well. And it's just in the case of renewables, that renewables are getting extra help through various other policies, but it leaves nuclear sort of sitting there without a safety net. And that's something we see really across all the OECD countries.
Thank you. I'm going to, with apology, pivot to questions from the audience because I want to make sure we've got enough time for that. This is a question, Janet, for you. The Clean Power Plan assumes nuclear continues at 20% of electricity generation for the country by 2030, but many plants are closing prematurely and more will before 2020. How can the Clean Power Plan stop that?
The Clean Power Plan is not all-powerful. And we also didn't just pick a number and stick it at the end of our regulatory impact analysis. That number came from the analysis that we did using a variety of factors and data and models that people are familiar with. I think that, as I say, we can't on our own through this policy change the trajectory for power plants that are affected by many factors, as Dave mentioned. But it is clear that if a power plant, a nuclear plant, closes down, that is zero carbon generation that a state will need to accommodate in its plan. And there's definitely an incentive built in to keep those clean resources going, and also an incentive to build new or to uprate existing nuclear plants, and states can choose policies that incentivize those activities under the Clean Power Plan.
So I'm going to do one more question, and I think it's an appropriate follow-up to the one you just took, Janet. And there's clearly a bit of interest in the Clean Power Plan in this room. It's my understanding the Clean Power Plan doesn't credit nuclear license extension. Why is that?
So we looked at the universe as of 2012, which is, we always have to have a starting place for whenever we do one of these technology-based rules, and so we built on that universe, and there's a certain amount of existing nuclear production at that time. We count as creditable in a plan anything that is new or uprated after that. An extension doesn't add more zero carbon generation into the system. It maintains the zero carbon generation that's already there. That is not to diminish the extensive effort that it takes to relicense a plant. It's reflecting, however, our job, which is carbon in the atmosphere and how those electrons are being generated.
Okay, I'm going to keep us on time here. Please join me in thanking our panelists on the first panel.